Welcome to Kingdom Thinking, an Australian Christian podcast dedicated to discussions of life, faith and theology. Now join the conversation with our host, Alistair Butcher. This episode of Kingdom Thinking explores the responsibility we have regarding the beliefs that we hold and share with others. What standards should we hold our beliefs to? Do we always need to be able to prove our beliefs beyond any kind of reasonable doubt? Or should we apply a different metric in different circumstances? Today, I want to address what is probably one of the most common arguments used against religious believers in both recent debate and debate long past, that since there is not enough evidence to believe in a God of any kind, that we should not suppose one exists. This argument is quite compelling and rather useful, as it does not require the atheist to bring to bear any evidence against the theist, but demands a comparatively high standard of evidence from the theist. Under this argument, atheism is the neutral condition, and religion is an extraordinary claim requiring extraordinary evidence. This claim was most viciously expressed by Richard Dawkins when he said, "Faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, perhaps even because of, the lack of evidence." This claim is not at all new. Moreover, this difficulty of belief is not at all new to philosophers either. To some degree, I even agree with the New Age atheists. We do have a responsibility to others regarding the beliefs we hold. Usually, when we talk about responsibility, we are discussing the things that a person is obligated to do. But in this episode, we will be talking about a different kind of responsibility called epistemic responsibility. Epistemic responsibility is the responsibility we hold regarding our beliefs, namely, what standard of evidence ought we hold our beliefs to? Or, to phrase it another way, how much evidence do you need before you can reasonably believe something? This question is the fundamental one that I will seek to answer over the course of this episode. The most basic level of epistemic responsibility is that we should not hold or act on beliefs that we know to be false. Almost everyone agrees with this one. A particularly useful example was phrased by W.K. Clifford in his essay The Ethics of Belief, published in 1877. Clifford tells the story of a ship owner who knows that his ship is in poor condition, having not had an inspection or repairs done in a very long time. However, that ship was due to make a very profitable journey across the Atlantic Ocean soon, and the cost of repairing the ship would be extremely high. Moreover, if the ship crashed or ran aground during the voyage, the ship owner would be in a position where he could simply claim the insurance and make most of his money back. If the ship owner were to convince himself that the ship were actually seaworthy, even though he knew for a fact that it wasn't, this would be wrong, as he would be convincing himself of a belief he knew to be untrue. Very few people take issue with this position, but Clifford took his argument of epistemic responsibility even further. Clifford claimed that it is wrong, always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything on insufficient evidence. This view came to be known as strong rationalism, and it has several extremely far-reaching consequences. Under Clifford's view, if there is any belief that you hold for which you cannot provide sufficient evidence, you are morally obligated to refrain from holding that belief. At first glance, this belief sounds quite attractive, particularly for those who are scientifically minded, as it rules out belief in all sorts of things for which there is no scientific evidence, such as the proposition that vaccines cause autism, that the world is flat, or that the moon is made of cheese. Furthermore, it also allows the atheist to completely dismiss many religious claims, since it is not strictly possible for anyone to provide the kind of concrete evidence an atheist would require. However, upon further inspection, this belief becomes quite problematic for a couple of reasons. First of all, this belief cannot stand under its own weight. You cannot provide concrete evidence for the belief that you ought to always have concrete evidence for your beliefs. Now, You can hold up Clifford's principle as something that has to be assumed for the system to work, but it tends to be rather unconvincing when you excuse your own beliefs from the standard to which you hold everyone else's. Another criticism of this belief was voiced by a contemporary of Clifford named William James. James argued that whenever we hold a belief, we are making a choice, namely a choice between believing in a certain thing or not believing in it. And the standard to which we hold our beliefs is dependent upon the choices we have available, and more critically, on the type of choice that it is. Key in William James's criticism of Clifford's position was a discussion on what James called forced choices. In James's view, a forced choice was a choice when you have no option but to make a decision. You cannot refrain from deciding. A good example of a forced choice is, for example, whether or not you want to go out with your friends on a Saturday night, or stay at home. You can wait for more evidence, or refrain from making a decision, but in doing so, you will end up staying at home, and then you've made your choice. Contrast this with an unforced choice, like which university you should go to. You can always choose not to go to university. Perhaps you aren't sure, and you don't want to spend any money while you aren't sure, and therefore you can opt out of making the decision. James essentially didn't buy the idea that atheism or agnosticism was truly a neutral position. James argued that either one believes in God and lives in light of that, or doesn't believe in God and lives in a naturalist framework. James argued that at the end of the day, when we die and the world comes to an end, there will be something or there will be nothing, and we will have made the choice about which belief we fall under by the way we have lived our lives up until that point. In particular, James recognized that there isn't enough evidence for you to make a completely rock-solid decision here. This is a critical point. If we look honestly at it, atheism isn't the neutral position that its followers claim it is. You can't simply refrain from making a decision about believing in God forever. You have to make a choice at some point in your life, and if you die having never made up your mind, then you have chosen unbelief. Thus, the response to the atheist who claims that there isn't enough evidence to concretely suppose the existence of a God is that there also isn't enough evidence to completely rule out the existence of the God. This isn't a rebuttal against their point, but rather a flaw in their entire framework. If you proceed in with Clifford's principle of strong rationalism, you'll find yourself making very little progress, and the conversation becomes very boring very quickly. However, because it is a forced choice, and it has potentially momentous consequences, we have to make a decision, and soon, given that our chance of death at any point in time continues to increase with our age, regardless of life choices. So, how then can we proceed in the face of insufficient evidence on both sides? Well, there are two primary alternatives to Clifford's strong rationalism that have been proposed by philosophers over the years, both of which I think may be useful to have an understanding of for an apologist. The first position is called fideism. Proponents of fideism, such as Søren Kierkegaard, argue that religious belief systems cannot be subjected to rational evaluation. Fideists argue that there are truths that can only be discovered apart from reason, and they essentially railed against the primarily Greek view that reason was the guiding principle for discovering truth in all areas. In his book Fear and Trembling, Søren Kierkegaard focuses particularly on the story of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son Isaac upon God's command, found in Genesis chapter 22. Kierkegaard argued that, in the eyes of a believer, and certainly in the eyes of New Testament authors, Abraham's act was one of great faith, one of laying down one of his most valuable things in the face of God's will. However, Kierkegaard further claimed that, for one who did not believe in any kind of God or supernatural force, it would rather appear to be a barbaric, unjustifiable attempted murder, driven by an insane delusion. Reason, Kierkegaard argued, could not understand such a position, and the greater truth behind this story could only be found by taking a leap of faith. This position of fideism echoes the words of the Apostle Paul, who writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 21, "For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe." Paul seems to be arguing that the world either could not or does not know God through wisdom. Under a fideist view, Christianity is not about deciding whether or not we believe certain claims, but it involves a relationship and a trust in a personal being that we have come to know, and such a relationship cannot be known, understood, or tested by reason alone, but only by taking a leap of faith. I certainly think there is merit to a fideist view, and I would even agree with Kierkegaard that many of the deeper mysteries and politically incorrect truths of the Christian faith can only begin to be understood once one is well and truly within the camp of Christianity. Finally, I also agree that the value of a Christian life cannot fully be understood by one outside of it, and that the majority of the confidence most Christians have in their faith does not come only from their reason, but from their relationship and personal experiences with their God. However, I think that the pure fideist also gives up a little bit too easily. Completely uncoupling reason from faith is rather unhelpful when one is considering the many places in life where they interact, and is even worse when attempting to have conversations against seasoned atheist logicians. Thus, the final view that can be understood is one called critical rationalism, articulated very finely by St. Thomas Aquinas, a 13th century priest, theologian, and philosopher, and argued very ably in the present day by Dr. Timothy Keller, pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian Church, in his book, The Reason for God. Keller argues that there are many arguments, stories, or testimonies about God that most people will find convincing, but acknowledges that there is no argument that is 100% persuasive to everyone of every viewpoint. However, Keller argues that it remains possible to compare the reasonableness of systems of belief, but just that we cannot expect conclusive proof. Combining this with the concept of a forced decision in William James's philosophy leads to, I believe, a rather more rational and useful point of view. When a decision about a belief is a forced decision and has sufficiently momentous consequences that everyone ought to care about the results, we should hold the beliefs that are the most reasonable, the most internally consistent, and the most justifiable. Under this argument of critical rationalism, the conversation is moved away from conclusive proof and towards arguments and statements that are convincing to people. This then is where the conversation can occur. Although I agree there is a certain fideist component to religion, that certain elements of it can only be truly understood from within the belief system, the most basic propositions about them can still be argued about. For example, under Christianity, we might not be able to understand all of the finer points from a purely logical point of view, but the argument as to whether or not Jesus actually lived, whether or not Jesus actually died, and whether or not Jesus actually rose from the dead is an historical event that can be discussed within a logical framework. From here, I believe that it is possible to show that, looking at all alternate ways of describing reality, that Christianity is the most reasonable explanation of our world and its current configuration. To again quote Paul in his letter to the Romans, he claims in chapter 1 verse 20, "For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse." Then, rather than considering if our arguments are airtight, logically perfect machines, we should be asking whether they are convincing, and what is convincing depends entirely on the person being witnessed to. Some will desire a complete and complex philosophical debate, going hammer and tongs over different arguments and exploring certain logical fallacies within the arguments, while others may find a convincing case for God in our personal testimonies and relational stories.